He came to buy the pretty daughter. He stayed because the forgotten one refused to disappear. The night Eli Holt rode through that storm, he told himself it was just business. He had told himself that for 3 days on the road through 2 river crossings and one night camped under a leaking sky. He had repeated it like a prayer, just business, just practical, just the most efficient solution to a problem that had been growing in his chest like a second heartbeat. He needed a woman who could work. He needed a household that functioned. He needed something to fill the silence that had settled over the Holt Ranch like snow that wouldn't melt even in July. He did not need to feel anything about it. The Calloway estate appeared through the rain like a memory of something that had once been fine. The columns were still standing, which was more than he could say for the fences. The house had the particular exhaustion of a place that had been proud too long, without the resources to justify it, paint peeling at the edges, shutters hanging at the wrong angle, a porch railing that listed to one side as if tired of the effort. It was the kind of decay that happened slowly so gradually that the people inside stopped seeing it. Eli had seen it before. He recognized it the way you recognize a disease. He tied his horse at the post and stood for a moment in the rain, letting the cold settle through his coat. 3 years since Rose. 3 years of waking up to a house that was a ranch and nothing more. 3 years of sleeping in rooms that had never learned how to be rooms without her in them. He was 42 years old and he was tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. Just business. He knocked. The door opened before his knuckles had fully landed. Harlan Calloway must have been watching from the window, which told Eli everything about how desperate the man was. He was tall, silver-haired, wearing a suit that had been expensive once. His smile had the practiced brightness of a man running on fear. "Mr. Holt." The handshake was too eager. "Please come in, come in. Terrible night for riding. I've ridden through worse." He stepped inside and took the room apart with one sweep of his eyes. Faded curtains, a fire that couldn't quite fight the damp, furniture that had been quality once and was now just old. And standing by the fireplace, posed as carefully as a painting, a young woman in blue silk. She rose when he entered. The firelight caught the gold in her hair, the careful arrangement of her curls, the practiced tilt of her smile. She was beautiful. She had been dressed to be beautiful, which was a different thing, though Eli had learned that distinction later in life than he should have. "Mr. Holt?" Her voice was warm, trained. "I'm Clara Calloway. What an honor." He took her hand, nodded, released it. That was when he saw the other one. She was standing in the doorway between the parlor and the kitchen, not fully in either room, which suggested long practice at occupying the space between places. She wore brown. Her dark hair was pulled back with no concession to decoration. She held a tea tray with the steadiness of someone accustomed to the weight of things, and her eyes, when they briefly met his, were the color of river water in October gray-green and entirely awake. She looked away immediately and stepped back toward the kitchen. Eli looked at Harlan. "My daughters," Harlan announced, sweeping one hand in an arc that managed to include both women while somehow centering only Clara. "Clara, my eldest, and Nora. She'll bring the tea." The younger daughter disappeared. Harlan launched into the speech he had clearly rehearsed. Eli listened with the patience of a man who understood that some people needed to talk their way into the center of what they actually meant. He heard the words estate legacy, temporary setback partnership, and translated them into what they were: debt, desperation, a man trying to sell something that wasn't worth what he was asking. Clara poured tea with the grace of someone trained from childhood to pour tea gracefully. She asked thoughtful questions about Montana. She smiled at the right moments. She was performing, and the performance was excellent. Eli accepted his cup and said, "Which daughter are you selling?" The silence that followed had edges. Harlan recovered quickly. "I prefer to think of it as an arrangement between families. Clara is accomplished in every domestic art." "I didn't ask what she was accomplished in. I asked which one you were offering." Clara's smile held, but her hands had gone very still on her teacup. In the kitchen doorway, a shadow shifted. The other daughter returned, listening. "Clara is the appropriate choice," Harlan said, his voice developing a harder edge. "She is educated, refined. She's 24 or 25. Eli set down his cup. "Beautiful, well-mannered, and you're selling her to a stranger rather than marrying her locally. Why? The suitable men in this county lack the money you need to pay the bank." Eli's tone wasn't cruel. He wasn't interested in cruelty. It cost too much. "I asked around before I came, Mr. Calloway. You have 60 days before they take everything. You've mortgaged every acre and probably the furniture. This isn't a family arrangement. It's a transaction, and I'd prefer we both be honest about it." Harlan's face moved through several expressions before settling on a controlled fury. From the kitchen doorway, the sound of a tray being set down very carefully on a counter. Eli looked at the doorway. "Miss Nora," he said, "would you come in, please?" A pause. Then the younger daughter appeared in the doorway, tea tray, gone hands clasped in front of her. She wore her stillness like armor. "Your father has been describing what you can offer," Eli said, looking at Clara. "I'd like to understand the full picture. Can you mend a fence?" Clara blinked. "I could learn. Birth a calf. I've never. Slaughter and dress a chicken. Treat a horse for colic. Manage accounts without a bookkeeper." With each question, Clara's composure developed small fractures, not broken but strained. She had been raised for a different examination than this one. "Mr. Holt, I was educated to manage a household to oversee." "I don't have anyone to oversee," Eli said. "I have 8 ranch hands who work sunup to sundown and expect to be fed on time. I have 3,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, and a house that's been without a woman's hand for 3 years. It's hard work, honest work. Is that something you were prepared for?" The question landed in the room like a stone in still water. Clara looked at her father. Her father looked at Eli. Neither of them looked at Nora, which told Eli more than anything else had. "What about the other one?" he said. The words had no inflection. They were not a question so much as a redirection of attention. Every eye in the room moved to Nora Calloway, who stood in the doorway and did not flinch under the weight of being seen. Eli crossed the room. He stopped 3 feet from her, close enough to see the calluses on her hands, the straight line of her spine, the careful set of her expression, and the faint shadow at the corner of her jaw that was not a shadow at all, but the fading edge of a bruise. He stopped looking at the bruise. He filed it. "You've been quiet," he said. "I wasn't asked to speak, Mr. Holt." Her voice was steady, not loud, not soft, just level, the way ground is level when someone has spent years walking over it without stumbling. "Can you mend a fence?" Something moved in her eyes. "Yes, sir. Wire a rail. Birth a calf. I pulled 6, lost 1. Manage accounts. I keep our household ledgers, what's left to keep." He saw Harlan stiffen in his peripheral vision. He didn't look at Harlan. "You work the land. 40 acres still under cultivation, vegetables, hay. I manage planting, harvest, and preservation. The horses feed, grooming, basic veterinary needs. The house maintenance, repairs, cooking." A pause. "And the accounts, as I said. You do all of that yourself. Clara has other responsibilities." She said it without bitterness. It was simply true. She manages correspondence, family connections, the social calendar. "So you do the work, and she does the presenting." "My sister has different skills, Mr. Holt." Her jaw tightened slightly. "They're just not the ones you're asking about." Eli looked at her for a moment longer than was strictly necessary for assessment. Then he turned back to Harlan. "I'll stay 3 days," he said. "I want to see your operation. I want to understand what I'm actually buying into." He looked at both daughters. "And I want to know which one of them can survive what I'm offering." "Mr. Holt," Harlan began. "Clara is the appropriate. I'll make my own determination." Eli picked up his hat. "I'll sleep in your barn. Tomorrow I start looking, unless you've changed your mind about needing my money." The silence was answer enough. He nodded to both women. "Ladies?" Then he walked back out into the storm. He lay awake in the barn for a long time, listening to the rain on the roof and the settling sounds of horses he didn't know. The stalls were clean, he noticed. The hay was properly stored. A barrel of oats sat with its lid secured against mice. Someone was managing this barn with care, in a house where care was apparently rationed. He thought about the bruise on Nora Calloway's jaw. He thought about Rose. Rose had been afraid of something in the last weeks. He had noticed, had asked twice, and she had said it was nothing. Just nerves, just a dream she kept having. He had believed her because he had wanted to believe her, because the alternative was that something was wrong and he had missed it, and he had been carrying that particular weight for 3 years. He pressed his hand flat against the stall wall and breathed. Just business. He slept eventually to the sound of rain. He was already awake when she came to the barn in the early morning, moving through the gray light with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this before dawn for years. She gathered eggs from the chicken coop, fed the pigs, checked the horse's water without looking at him, though she clearly knew he was there. He had been brushing down his horse. He kept brushing. "Your father hit you," he said. Her hand went still on the bucket handle. Then she set it down and turned to face him. "He was upset about the arrangement." "That's not an answer." "He was upset, Sen," she repeated carefully, "about the arrangement not proceeding as he'd planned, because you paid attention to the wrong daughter." "Because I paid attention at all." He put down the curry comb. Most men in my position would have taken your father's recommendations, signed the papers, and left. Why didn't you stay out of it the way he told you to? She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. Because you asked me a direct question, and I'm not capable of lying to someone's face about things that matter. The animals need honest answers the same as people do. A pause. Besides, someone had to tell you about the land. And if your father had locked you in your room for the next 3 days, then I'd have answered through the window. Something that was not quite a smile moved through his expression. Breakfast will be ready in an hour, she said, picking up her basket. Father expects you at the house, and you'll be serving, but not sitting. Yes, sir. She moved toward the door, then paused. Mr. Holt, my father's a desperate man. Desperate men do things they wouldn't otherwise do. She wasn't making excuses. She was giving him information. I'd ask you to factor that in when you're making your assessment. I'll factor in everything I see. That's all I'm asking. She left. He watched her go, this woman in brown who walked through the world as if she expected to be overlooked and had long since stopped expecting anything else. He went to breakfast. Breakfast was a performance. Clara wore a green dress the color of spring grass, her hair arranged in soft curls that caught the morning light with practiced precision. She laughed at Harlan's attempts at conversation. She asked Eli thoughtful questions about the ranch. She was warm and gracious and composed, and Eli spent most of the meal watching Nora move silently around the table, refilling coffee, clearing plates, existing in the margins like a footnote to someone else's story. The coffee she refilled into his cup was exactly the right temperature. He noticed. He suspected she had been managing that particular detail for years. After breakfast, Harlan organized a tour of the property. Clara came with a parasol despite the drizzle. Eli listened to Harlan's descriptions of what the land had been and what it would be again, and translated silently. What it was now was damaged, depleted, running on borrowed time and borrowed money. He found himself looking for Nora. She was at the south fence line when he broke away from the tour, mending a section with the focused competence of someone who had learned the work properly. She didn't look up when he approached. Your father says the south pasture could support 50 head of cattle after clearing. My father's optimistic. She secured a length of wire with a practiced twist. This field needs 2 seasons of management before it'll carry significant grazing. The soil's been depleted, drainage is poor. You can see the thistle infestation along the north section. What would you do with it if it were yours? She looked up then. Something shifted behind her eyes, the particular flicker of someone who has had opinions they weren't allowed to express and is being directly invited to express one. First season, nitrogen-fixing cover crop. Clover or vetch till it under before winter. Second season, hay rotation cut twice, so I'll half use half to rebuild the soil. Third season, introduce cattle cautiously and watch how the land responds. She paused. It's a 3-year plan before real profit. That's patient. Push the land too hard too soon and you ruin it for a decade. I learned that from watching my father not be patient and then trying to repair the damage. Harlan, who had caught up with them, made a strangled sound. Eli held up one hand. I asked for honesty, he said. Seems I'm getting it. They walked the property for 2 hours. Nora laid out every problem with the quiet thoroughness of someone presenting the timber restrictions, the soil conditions, the equipment that needed replacement, the fencing that would need to be rebuilt from scratch if the land were ever to function properly again. Harlan grew increasingly agitated. Clara trailed behind with ruined shoes and an increasingly miserable expression. Eli asked Nora questions. Nora answered them. By the time they returned to the house, the shape of what this land actually was had become perfectly clear. He took his lunch in the barn. Nora brought it, an hour later, cold chicken and bread on a plain plate, no pretense. Thank you, he said. For the food or the honesty this morning? Both. She started to go. He said, stay a moment. She stopped, not quite turning. Your sister is a good woman. She is, kind, loyal, well-meaning. A pause. She was raised for a different world than the one we're actually living in. And you, she turned then, looked at him with those October water eyes. I was raised to survive, Mr. Holt. That's what I was given. Why aren't you angry about it? The question seemed to find something in her. She was quiet for a moment. What good would it do? Would anger feed the horses or fix the fences or keep my sister from knowing how close we are to real starvation? She looked away. Anger is a luxury. I've learned to work instead. That's the second time you've called something a luxury that most people consider a basic right. Most people haven't lived my life. He looked at her at the calluses, the straight spine, the careful face, and he thought about what it would mean to bring this woman west. He thought about Rose. He thought about the house that had been a house for 3 years without knowing how to be one. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what's practical, not what's necessary. If you could have anything." She looked as if no one had asked her that question in years. Perhaps no one had. "Land that responds to care instead of dying despite it," she said quietly to the middle distance. "Work that builds something instead of just preventing collapse." A longer pause. "To matter, not because I'm useful, because someone actually sees me." The words landed in the silence of the barn and stayed there. Eli looked at her for a moment. "Then come to Montana." She went very still. "Come to Montana. Be my wife. Build something real. You came here for Clara. Clara is your father's choice. You're mine. You've known me 2 days. I've known enough people to recognize substance when I see it." He held her gaze. "I need a partner, Nora. Someone who understands that the work is the point and the land is the point, and neither of those things are going to stop being hard no matter how much you wish they would. Someone who won't break when things go wrong because things will go wrong." He paused. "I'm not offering you romance. I'm offering you respect. A share of what we build. A seat at the table instead of beside it." She was quiet for a long moment. "Then I need to think." "You have until tomorrow morning. That's when I'm telling your father my decision." He climbed down from where he'd been sitting and left her in the barn standing in the straw-filtered light with her hands loose at her sides and her expression doing something complicated he didn't stay to interpret. That night, the second night, the storm had settled into a steady drizzle that made everything outside the windows look like a watercolor left in the rain. Nora was in the parlor when she heard Eli's boots on the porch, not coming in, just the sound of someone standing there. She took her shawl and went out. He was sitting on the porch rail, his back to the wall, looking at nothing. He had a cup of something warm in his hands, had made it himself, she realized without asking. He didn't look at her when she came out. She sat in the chair beside him. She didn't ask what he was thinking about. A minute passed, then 2. The rain fell soft and constant, and the night smelled of wet grass and wood smoke, and October and Nora pulled her shawl tighter and let the silence be what it was. Then Eli said very quietly, "My wife loved nights like this." Said the storm was the sky crying out the things it couldn't say in daylight. Nora did not speak. She understood this was not an invitation for response. It was something being set down gently in the space between two people who barely knew each other. She said that storms were honest, he continued, that everything else was just weather, but a real storm meant the sky was telling the truth. The fire from inside the parlor cast a faint orange edge on the porch boards. "She was right," Nora said finally, quietly. Not about him, about the storms. Something eased in his expression, just slightly. They sat for another 10 minutes without speaking. Then Nora stood, touched the back of the chair once, and went inside. She lay awake until nearly midnight. This man was not what she had expected. She had expected transaction, and there was transaction. She was clear-eyed enough to see that, but there was also something else, something that lived in the way he sat with his grief, like it was a fact of weather and not a wound he was tending. He had built something real from nothing. He spoke of partnership the way other men spoke of taking. He had looked at her and asked what she wanted, and the asking itself had been a kind of answer. She thought about the bruise on her own jaw. She thought about 3 more years of this house, of this work of her father's hands and her sister's carefully maintained indifference. She thought about work that built nothing, labor that preserved nothing, days that accumulated into more days that were only ever about not letting things collapse. She thought about land that responded to care. She was almost asleep when Clara slipped through her door. "He's going to choose you," Clara said. No preamble. Nora looked at her sister in the candlelight, still beautiful even at midnight, even without the performance. Her hair down, her face younger than it had been downstairs. "I know," Nora said. "I'm not angry." Clara sat on the edge of the bed. "I should be. I've spent 3 years being prepared for this, the right dress, the right conversation, the right smile. And then a man comes and doesn't want any of it." Her laugh was soft and a little broken. "He never even saw me. Not really. He's looking for something specific. He's looking for you." Clara twisted her hands in her lap. "I don't want to go to Montana, Nora. I've never wanted to go. The thought of it, 3,000 acres and 8 rough men and no one to call on, and winters that last 6 months." She stopped. "I've been terrified since Father wrote the letter. And then when he walked in and he looked at you instead of me, the first thing I felt was—" "Relief," Nora said. Clara exhaled. "Yes, They sat with that for a moment. What happens to you? Nora said. If I go, I survive. Clara met her eyes. You've been showing me how to do that for years. I just wasn't paying attention. A pause. I'll find my own way out. Not this way, not this man, not this arrangement, but something. I'll find something that fits who I actually am. She reached across and took Nora's hand. You've spent your whole life making yourself small enough to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. Stop. Be as large as you actually are. Nora looked at her sister. I'm going to say yes, she said. I know. Clara squeezed her hand and let go. Good. Bye. The third morning arrived clean and cold, the storm finally spent. Nora dressed before dawn in her best dress, not the brown, not the gray, but a deep blue wool that had been her mother's and had been let out at the seams twice and still fit imperfectly, but it was the best she had, and today she was going to use the best she had. She went downstairs. She built up the kitchen fire. She put water on to boil. The front door opened, and Eli came in from outside, snow-dusted face ruddy with cold. You're up early, she said. Couldn't sleep? He moved to the stove and held his hands over it. Neither could you. I've been up before dawn most of my life. This morning doesn't feel different, doesn't it? She turned to look at him. He was watching her with those pale, careful eyes that took in everything and gave back very little. Yes, she said, before he asked. My answer is yes. He was quiet for a moment, then, you have questions first. I do. Ask them. She poured coffee into 2 cups, handed him one, wrapped her hands around her own. You've been married before. It was not a question. She had worked it out from the way he spoke of the woman he'd lost, not like someone describing a failed arrangement, but like someone describing a person who had been real. 3 years ago, he said. Her name was Rose. She died. Yes. The word was short, not close, just precise. There was an accident. A horse. I've spent 3 years believing it was my fault. He looked into his cup. I've been told recently that it may not have been what I thought it was. That there are things I don't know yet. Nora set down her cup. You're carrying guilt for something you may not have done. That's an accurate description. Does it change things? Why you want to marry? He met her eyes. I'm not looking for someone to replace her. I'm looking for something that Rose and I were never actually going to have because we wanted different things from the same life, and neither of us was honest about it early enough. A pause. I'm looking for partnership. I'm looking for someone who sees the same thing when they look at a piece of land, not a backdrop, not a hardship, but a thing worth caring for. That's a cold calculation. It's an honest one, but it doesn't have to be a cold marriage, Nora. Respect can grow into more than respect. It just has to start somewhere real. She thought about her parents' marriage built on romance and gentility and the assumption that feeling things deeply was enough to sustain a life. She thought about what it had cost them. I'm afraid, she said, of trading one kind of servitude for another. Then let me be clear. His voice was steady. If you come with me, you work alongside me directing. The household, the accounts, the decisions, those are yours. Shared with me, not delegated to you while I make the real choices. He held her gaze. What we build, you own half of. What you earn, you have a say in spending. And if I ever raise a hand to you, his jaws tightened. I won't. But if I did, you have my permission to take everything and leave, and I'd consider it my own fault and no one else's. She looked at him for a long moment, at the steady, weathered face, at the hands that had built 3,000 acres from bare ground, at the eyes that had looked at her, actually looked at her in a house where she had spent years being furniture. There's something else, she said, something I need to tell you before I agree. He waited. I think the man who lent my father money, Frank Slade, I think he may have known your wife, Clara told me. I don't know if it's true, but if it is, then by marrying me, you may be walking into a situation with someone who already has reasons to dislike you. She met his eyes. I wanted you to know before you decided. Something changed in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recognition, a piece fitting into a shape he hadn't quite completed yet. Frank Slade, he said. You know him. I know the name. He set down his cup. He was from Philadelphia. He was someone Rose knew before she knew me. The silence between them had weight. I'm not asking you to protect me from whatever that is, Nora said quietly. I'm asking you to know about it before we start. He looked at her with something that was, she thought, the closest thing to gratitude she had seen from him. All right, he said. We go in with clear eyes. That's all I ask. He reached across his table and took her hand once briefly. A handshake more than a gesture of romance. A beginning. Then we have a father to speak to, he said. What followed was the inevitable storm. Harlan came downstairs in his best suit. Clara came after him pale and quiet, her eyes finding Nora's across the table with a question that Nora answered with the smallest nod. Something sagged in Clara's shoulders relief and the particular grief of relief. Breakfast was short. Eli set down his fork and looked at Harlan. I'd like a word, privately. Harlan practically moved toward his study. The moment the door closed, Clara reached across the table and gripped Nora's hand. It's done, Nora said quietly. It's decided. Are you frightened? Terribly. Good, Clara said, and her voice only broke a little. Fear means it's real. From behind the study door came the sound of Harlan's voice rising, and then Eli's voice cutting through it low flat, carrying the particular quality of someone who has decided how things are going to go. The door opened. Harlan came out first, face dark, red eyes bright with something between fury and humiliation. He looked at Nora and she saw the calculation. The old familiar one, the one that said she was a piece being moved on a board, and the board hadn't gone the way he planned. You did this, he said. I answered questions honestly. Her voice surprised her. It was steady, steadier than she expected. That's all I did. You undermined your sister. You made yourself indispensable. You maneuvered. She told the truth. Eli had followed Harlan out of the study and placed himself not between them exactly, but at Nora's side. Just close enough. Your daughter told the truth when you asked everyone else to perform. That's not manipulation. That's character. You're in my house. I'm in your house making you an offer you don't have the luxury of refusing. Eli's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I'll settle your bank debt and your most immediate creditors. That buys you time to make decisions that aren't desperate ones. In exchange, you sign the marriage consent without further discussion. He paused. Or I walk out that door and you explain to the bank in 60 days why they should show you mercy. Your choice. The calculation was brief and brutal, and Harlan made it with the practiced speed of a man who had been making calculations and losing them for years. Fine, he said. The word came out like something broken off. Take her. Nora had known this moment was coming. She had thought in abstract that she was prepared for it. She had not fully accounted for the particular shape of hearing her father say, take her in the same tone he might use to discuss livestock. Something in her chest made a decision. Father. She waited until he looked at her. I'm not going because you're giving me away. I'm going because I'm choosing to. A pause. I wanted you to know the difference. Even if it doesn't matter to you. Harlan stared at her. For just a moment, the briefest fracture in the performance, she thought she saw him. The man underneath the desperation and the pride, the man who had once carried her on his shoulders through these same halls, who had taught her to read ledgers and manage accounts, because he saw the value in a daughter who understood how the world worked. The fracture closed. He turned and went back into his study. Clara let out a breath. Eli's hand came to rest briefly on Nora's shoulder. Not comfort exactly, not reassurance, but presence. Someone standing beside her. She had not had that before. The minister came the next morning, a practical man who knew the Calloway family and asked no questions beyond the legal ones. Harlan remained in his study. Clara stood beside Nora with tears streaming silently down her face and her chin held high. The ceremony was brief. Nora said her vows in a clear voice. Eli placed a plain gold band on her finger, and when the minister pronounced them married, he kissed her forehead, a gesture more covenant than romance, more beginning than conclusion. She became Nora Holt, no longer Calloway, no longer the wrong daughter, the overlooked one, the one in the margins. Nora Holt, wife to a man who had chosen her for what she was rather than what she was supposed to be. Ready, Eli said. She looked around the parlor one last time. The faded curtains, the threadbare carpet. Her mother's portrait on the wall, watching with that careful expression that had never quite been sorrow and never quite been acceptance, but had always been love, even when love was insufficient. She thought about all the mornings she had risen before dawn in this house, all the fences mended, the ledgers balanced, the animals tended, and the meals prepared, and the disasters quietly managed, while everyone around her pretended the disasters weren't happening. All the years of making herself small enough to fit into the spaces between other people's needs. She was done with small. Yes, she said, I'm ready. Clara held her at the door, fierce and brief. Write me everything, she whispered. The ugly parts, too. I want to know what it looks like when you finally stop disappearing. I promise. Be impossible, Nora. For once in your life, be completely impossible. Nora laughed, a real one, small and startled and genuine. She kissed her sister's cheek. She walked out into the cold Virginia morning where the wagon was loaded and the sky was clear and the road to the west was waiting. She did not look back. The first mile passed in silence, then the second. By the third, the Calloway estate had disappeared into the trees behind them, and ahead was just road and sky and the enormous, terrifying, wide-open fact of a future that was hers to make. "You're quiet," Eli said. "I'm thinking about Tia, about the fact that I just married a man I've known for 3 days." She paused. "About Montana, about what you meant when you said there are things about your wife's death you don't know yet." She looked at him. "About Frank Slade." He was quiet for a moment. The horse's hooves were steady on the hard ground. "Tell me what you know," he said finally. "Clara overheard something she wasn't supposed to. My father borrowed money from Frank Slade, a significant amount a year before you came. She doesn't know the terms, but she knows that Slade and Rose knew each other in Philadelphia. Before you. That's accurate. She thinks Slade has been in Montana or near it." Eli said nothing. His hands on the reins were steady, but Nora had learned to read steadiness. It wasn't the same as calm. "I'm not asking you to tell me everything," she said. "I know we haven't earned that yet. I'm asking you to know that I know and that I'm not afraid of it." He looked at her, then a sideways glance, brief, assessing. "You're not what I expected." "What did you expect?" "Someone practical, capable." A pause. "Not someone who walks into difficulty with her eyes open and her hands steady." "I've been walking into difficulty my whole life," she said. "I've just learned to keep my hands steady while I do it." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, low and surprised. They rode on through the morning west toward the mountains, west toward 3,000 acres, and a house that needed to become a home, and a man who was carrying a grief he might not have earned, and a past that might not be finished with him yet. But Nora Holt kept her eyes on the road. She had learned over 22 years that the only direction worth looking was forward. Part 2. What the land keeps. Montana arrived like a fact. Not gradually, not gently, it arrived, the way a door opens onto a room you weren't prepared for, and suddenly you are inside it and the door's behind you, and there is nothing to do but adjust your eyes to the new light. Nora pressed her face against the train window and watched the country unfold. Virginia had been soft country even in its hardness hills, that curved forest that filtered light into something manageable, a horizon that was always interrupted by something before it could overwhelm you. Here the sky was the first thing you saw, and the last thing you could look away from. It was enormous. It pressed down on the land with the casual indifference of something that had been enormous for longer than anyone could remember, and would remain so long after everyone had stopped noticing. The grasslands went on in every direction like something God had left unfinished. Nora looked at it and thought, "This is what I chose." She said it to herself not as reassurance but as orientation, a fixed point in a landscape that offered very few of them. Beside her, Eli watched the country pass with the proprietary ease of a man in his own territory. He had been pointing out landmarks since they crossed the territory line, a distinctive ridge formation, a river bend, the distant smoke of a ranch she would one day be able to name. He did not perform the country for her. He simply shared it the way you share something you have long owned and stopped needing to explain. "It's very large," she said. "It is. Does it ever stop being large?" "No." He looked at her sideways. "But you stop feeling small in it, eventually." They arrived in Helena on a gray afternoon that smelled of winter already settling in for its long stay. The air was different here, thinner, colder, with an edge that Virginia's cold had never had. Nora pulled her coat tighter and watched the town fall away behind them as Eli drove the wagon out of the livery yard and onto the rutted road heading north. 2 hours, he had said. The roads are rough but passable. She watched the mountains. They were not like the mountains she had imagined, not the storybook versions with their neat triangular silhouettes and their picturesque snow. These were jagged and ancient and indifferent, rising out of the plain with the blunt particularity of something that had earned its height through violence and time. They were beautiful the way difficult things are beautiful because the difficulty was part of what made them worth seeing. She was still looking at them when the wagon crested a rise and Eli pulled the horses to a stop. "There," he said. She looked where he pointed and saw it, a cluster of buildings set in a valley, smoke rising from a chimney, fences running in neat lines across the brown grass. A two-story house built from timber and stone, solid and plain, and clearly constructed by someone who understood that in this country, the first requirement of any structure was that it stand. Barns and outbuildings arranged around it with practical logic. And beyond, in the middle distance, cattle moving slowly through the grass. The Holt Ranch. It was nothing like the Calloway estate had been in its prime, and everything like what the Calloway estate had failed to remain. Home, Eli said, and the word had in it a quality she hadn't heard before, something settled and private, the way people say the names of the places they have built with their own hands. A man emerged from the barn as they pulled into the yard, lean and weathered, maybe 45, with the kind of face that looked like it had been tested repeatedly and had passed each time. He raised a hand in greeting. "Jed," Eli said in the break. "Didn't expect you back for another few days." The man's eyes moved to Nora with the assessing directness of someone who valued time too much for pretense. "Made good time, Jed. This is my wife, Nora." Something moved across Jed's face, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, a rapid adjustment to new information. He touched his hat. "Ma'am, welcome." "Thank you." She held his gaze. He had careful eyes, this man, eyes that knew things. He unloaded the trunk with efficient strength and headed for the house without further ceremony, which she suspected was his version of acceptance. Eli helped her down from the wagon and they followed. The house was cold and sparse and functional, which she had expected. What she had not expected was how it would feel to walk through it, not as a guest, not as a servant, but as someone who belonged there. The main room had a stone fireplace that dominated one wall. The kitchen was larger than the Calloway kitchen had been and better equipped. The root cellar, when she found it that first evening, made her stand still in the lamplight for a full 30 seconds. The potatoes had no soft spots. 6 barrels of them, properly stored, properly sealed. Apples wrapped in paper. Preserved vegetables in neat rows. Smoked meat hanging from the rafters in organized quantities. Everything exactly as it should be managed by someone who understood what it meant to go into winter with adequate stores. She had been going into every winter for 3 years not knowing if they would have adequate stores. She stood in that cellar and felt something unknot in her chest slowly, like a fist that has been clenched for so long, it has forgotten what open feels like. "Everything all right?" Eli's voice came from the top of the stairs. "Yes." She took a breath. "Yes, it's fine. It's all fine." She climbed back up into the kitchen where he had started a fire in the stove and was slicing bacon with the competence of a man who had been feeding himself for years and didn't consider it beneath him. He made supper without being asked, without suggesting she should, without anything in his manner indicating that cooking for himself on his wife's first night was anything other than the obvious thing to do. She watched him work and felt the knot unknot another increment. They ate at the kitchen table and he talked about the ranch, the rhythms of it, the hands, the work that would come with spring. She listened and asked questions and let herself believe cautiously that this might be a thing she could learn to call home. Later in the bedroom that was now their bedroom, Eli showed her the window latches and the quirks of the house without embarrassment or performance. And when he paused at the edge of what the night's arrangement would be, she saved him the hesitation. "We're married," she said simply. "I'm not interested in managing appearances." He looked at her for a moment. "All right." They prepared for bed with the careful courtesy of 2 adults who were accustomed to privacy and intended to respect each other's. But in the darkness, when the house had settled around them and the wind was moving outside with a sound she didn't know yet, but was already beginning to learn, she said, "Eli, your root cellar has no soft spots in the potatoes." A pause. "That's generally considered a good sign." "I know." She looked at the ceiling she couldn't quite see. "I've spent 3 years going into winter not knowing if we'd make it through. Not telling Clara, not letting Father understand how close we were. Just managing the numbers and hoping." A breath. "Here the numbers are right. Someone already did the work. I don't have to fix anything. I just have to help maintain something that's already working." Silence for a moment. Then his hand found hers under the quilt, warm, certain. "You're not here to fix anything," he said. "You're here to build with me. There's a difference." She held his hand in the dark and let herself for the first time in longer than she could remember rest. Very soon. She met the hands at breakfast the next morning. There were 8 of them, she had known. This had been preparing. And they came in together with the wary collective energy of men confronting an unknown variable in a system they had mastered. She had the stove hot and bacon sizzling before the first boot hit the porch. Eli introduced her from his seat at the table. "Boys, this is my wife, Nora. She's running the house now." They introduced themselves one by one, hats in hand, touching hat brims, eyes measuring. She met each gaze and filed each name, Jed she knew. Then Will and Pete and young Danny, who was barely 19 and looked like he'd never been this close to a woman who wasn't his mother. Sam older, weathered with the particular stillness of someone who had seen a great deal and stopped being surprised by most of it. Dutch massive and quiet. Rowan and his cousin Henry. Breakfast will be ready in 10 minutes, she said. Coffee's hot. Help yourselves. She served them efficiently bacon eggs, biscuits that had risen better than she'd hoped given an unfamiliar oven. She watched them eat with the focused intensity of physical laborers, and she watched something else too, who poured coffee for the man beside him, who waited without being asked, who tracked her movements with simple curiosity versus the particular wariness of someone threatened by change. After his third biscuit, young Danny said, "These are real good, ma'am." "Thank you." She refilled the platter. "I'll need to know everyone's preferences. Dietary restrictions, anything you genuinely can't eat. I'd rather know now than waste food or make someone sick." The men exchanged glances. Sam cleared his throat. "No restrictions, ma'am. Ranch hands eat what's put in front of them." "That may be how it's been," she said pleasantly, "but it's not going to be how it is. I'm not interested in feeding people food they can't tolerate out of principle." She looked at the table. "Anyone." Will coughed. "Dutch doesn't eat pork, religious reasons." Dutch's expression didn't change, but something in his posture acknowledged that this had been said. "Understood," Nora said. "I'll make sure there's always an alternative." She looked at Dutch directly. "It won't be a production, it'll just be taken care of." The big man looked at her for a moment, then he nodded once slowly. After they filed out, Eli lingered to help clear the table. "You handled that well. They were testing me." "They were, and you passed." He stacked plates. "The way you asked about restrictions, instead of assuming they'll remember that." "I meant it." She scraped plates into the scrap pail. "I'm here to work with them, not at them." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I think you're going to be fine here, Nora." She looked at him over the stack of dishes. "I think so too," she said. "Ask me again in February." November deepened, then December. The cold settled in with a permanence that Virginia's winters had never achieved. A cold that didn't merely suggest discomfort, but built it into the architecture of every morning. Water froze in the basin overnight. Breath clouded the air inside the barn until the animals warmed it. The land went still and hard and white, and the mountains on the horizon became something she couldn't stop looking at, enormous and permanent and completely indifferent to whether any of this was difficult. She found her rhythm. She woke before dawn started. The kitchen fire had breakfast ready by the time the hands arrived. After they dispersed to their work, she moved through the house cleaning, preserving, mending accounts. Mrs. Cooper, a neighbor's widow who had been helping with heavy work and preserving before Nora's arrival, came twice a week and became quickly one of the most useful people Nora had ever known. She was a woman of around 50. May Cooper built like someone who had spent decades at practical work and had developed the physical and moral density that such work produces. She had lived in this country for 20 years. She had buried a child in it, a daughter 3 winters back, a fever she hadn't caught in time. She carried this the way Eli carried his grief, not hidden, just integrated a fact of her particular geography. "Back east," May said one afternoon as they worked together on putting up a late batch of dried apples. "You worry about moths in the flour and mold in the cellar. Out here it's mice and cold. Everything needs to be sealed right, stored proper, or it'll be gone by spring." "I found mouse droppings in the oat barrel last week," Nora said. "Get a cat, or a good terrier. Doesn't matter which, long as it's got the instinct." May worked with the particular efficiency of someone who had never had time to work any other way. Mr. Holt never bothered, figured a few mice weren't worth the trouble. A sideways glance. Things change when there's a woman running a household properly. Nora filed this away, not the mice, but what May was telling her underneath the mice. Things change. You are making things change. That is the point. May lost her daughter in December 3 years ago. She said one afternoon out of context while they were preserving the last of the fall vegetables. She said it with the directness of someone setting a stone on a table. Not seeking sympathy, just telling the truth. Nora set down her knife. "I'm sorry. Fever. We didn't have anyone who knew how to treat it properly, not in time. The nearest doctor was a day's ride, and we lost 12 hours deciding if she was sick enough to send for him." May's hands kept moving. "Since then, I've made a study of what I can learn to treat myself. Medicines compresses the signs that mean you need to move fast. Out here, you can't afford to not know these things. She glanced at Nora. I'll teach you if you want to learn. I want to learn everything you can teach me, Nora said. May looked at her for a moment with those sharp, experienced eyes. Yes, she said. I thought you might. They worked in companionable silence, and Nora learned wound care and fever management and the particular herbs that kept best through a Montana winter. And she stored this knowledge the same way she stored everything else, carefully, completely organized for retrieval when it would actually be needed. She thought about Rose Holt while she learned these things, about a woman who had been afraid of something in the last weeks of her life, about a saddle strap that may or may not have been cut. She had not told Eli yet what Jed knew. She was waiting for the right moment, and in the meantime, she watched Jed watch the way he served Eli, with the particular devotion of someone who had made a decision long ago and lived by it. Watch the way he sometimes looked at Eli with something that was not quite guilt, but was not quite clear either. He was a good man, she thought, a man who had made a choice he believed was protective and was now living in the shadow of it. The evenings were the best part of the days. After supper, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and the dishes were done and the fire was stoked for the night, Eli and Nora sat in the main room. He worked on ledgers and plans and correspondence. She mended or read or did her own accounting. They talked when there was something worth saying and didn't talk when there wasn't, and this comfortable inhabitation of shared silence was something she had not had before and had not known to want and now recognized as one of the most significant facts of her life. One evening in mid-December, as snow fell thick and steady outside the dark windows, Eli set down his pen and looked at her. You're thinking about something that worries you, he said. She looked up from the account book. Am I that obvious? You go very still when something concerns you. It's the same stillness you had in your father's house, but quieter now. He closed his ledger. What is it? She set aside her book. She had been building toward this. She had not been sure she was ready, but he had looked at her directly as he always did, and she was not capable of deflecting a direct question from someone who deserved the answer. Jed knows something about Rose, she said, about how she died. The fire crackled. Eli's expression did not change immediately. Then carefully, how long have you known this? A few weeks. He told me not intentionally. He'd had too much to drink one evening when I was checking the barn before bed. He said the horse hadn't spooked on its own. She met Eli's eyes. He said someone cut the saddle strap. The silence was very long. Outside, the wind moved snow across the yard with a sound like whispered accusation. He knows who, Eli said. It was not quite a question. He suspects. He doesn't have proof. She kept her voice steady. This needed to be said steadily. He suspects Frank Slade. Eli stood up from his chair and walked to the window. He stood there looking out at the white darkness, his hands at his sides, very still. She waited. He never told me, Eli said finally, and the words came out with a particular quality, not anger, but something older and heavier. The particular desolation of someone who has been carrying a weight they might not have needed to carry. He was trying to protect you, Nora said. I believe that. I think he was afraid that if you knew you'd go looking for Slade and something worse would happen. She paused. That doesn't make it right, but I think it's true. Eli turned from the window. His face was doing something complicated, the kind of complicated that comes from 3 years of one story being replaced suddenly by the possibility of a different story. I've been telling myself it was my fault for 3 years, he said. I know. I left her alone that afternoon. The horse she was riding was one she knew, but I hadn't checked the tack that morning. I should have checked it. Eli. Her voice was quiet. If the strap was cut, then none of what you checked or didn't check matters. Someone else made the decision that killed her, not you. He stood in the firelight looking at her, and she saw it. The specific moment when a grief that has been solid and certain suddenly becomes uncertain. It is not relief. It is something stranger than relief. It is standing at the edge of a wound you have tended for years and being told the wound may be different than you thought, and not knowing yet whether that changes the hurting. I need to speak to Jed, he said. Yes. Tonight. I think that's right. He crossed the room, took her hand once, and held it for a moment before releasing it. Not gratitude exactly, something more reciprocal. Then he put on his coat and went out into the snow. Nora sat alone in the warm kitchen and listened to the fire and thought about Rose Holt, a woman she had never met, a woman who had been afraid of something in her last weeks and hadn't said what a woman who had been married to a good man and had died in a way that he had spent 3 years believing was his failure. She thought, I hope she knew she was loved. She thought, I hope this brings him something like rest. She made tea and waited. He was gone for 2 hours. When he came back, the snow was in his hair, and his face had the particular emptiness of someone who has just learned something that changes the shape of years. He sat down at the kitchen table across from her, and she set a cup in front of him. Jed told me everything, he said. What do you know now? He found the strap the day after Rose died. He'd been meaning to examine it before the funeral, but by then it had been moved. By the time he found it and looked at it closely, the cut was there. Clean, not fraying. He knew what it meant. Eli's hands were wrapped around the cup. He didn't tell me because he said he'd never seen me like I was in those weeks after she died, and he was afraid of what I'd do if I knew someone had done it deliberately. He protected you. He protected me by letting me blame myself for 3 years. There was no bitterness in it, just the fact turned over, examined. He meant well, and he was probably right that I'd have gone after Slade, and it would have ended badly. A long pause. I don't know what I'm supposed to feel. You don't have to feel anything specific, Nora said. You just found out that the story you've been living inside was a different shape than the real one. That takes time to settle. He looked at her across the table. You're very calm about this. I'm not calm. I've been sitting here for 2 hours being not calm very quietly. She met his eyes. I'm scared, Eli. If Frank Slade killed Rose because she chose you over him, and now you've married again and he knows it. She stopped. I'm not a woman who frightens easily, but I'm frightened of this. I won't let anything happen to you. I know you'll try. She folded her hands on the table. But I'm not asking for a promise. I'm asking that we figure out together what this means and what we do about it. Not you protecting me from it. Both of us together deciding how to face it. He looked at her for a long moment. In the firelight, his face was tired, and something else, something that was beginning slowly to be something other than closed. All right, he said, together. They sat at the kitchen table for another hour, planning without pretense. They were methodical about it, the way people who understand practical problems approach practical problems, identifying what they knew, what they didn't, what the risks were, what options existed. It was not romantic. It was the work of two people taking a threat seriously. It was also, Nora thought, partnership. Exactly the thing he had offered her, and she had accepted not rescue, but collaboration. Not protection, but standing together in the same direction. When they finally went upstairs to bed, he paused in the doorway of the bedroom and looked at her in a way he hadn't quite looked at her before, with something added to the assessment. Something that had moved beyond practical evaluation into whatever comes after you have sat across a kitchen table from someone at midnight and worked through the worst thing you know and found them still there, still steady, still facing you. He didn't say anything, neither did she. But she thought, there it is, the beginning of something real. January brought 3 weeks of cold so profound it seemed personal. Nora learned the particular physical language of Montana winter, the way the cold settled into your bones if you stood still, too long outside the way. Frost formed on the inside of windows before dawn. The way the horse's breath in the barn created a warm fog that was the best part of getting up before sunrise. She learned to layer her clothing with the seriousness of someone who understood that being insufficiently warm was not merely uncomfortable, but potentially dangerous. She learned other things too. She learned that young Danny, for all his nervous energy, at meals was a gifted hand with injured animals, patient and instinctive in a way that reminded her of the best qualities of her own work. She began consulting him when the stock showed signs of illness. He responded to being consulted by becoming someone who could be relied upon. She learned that Rowan had a wife back in Missouri he sent money to every month without fail, and that this fact made him serious about wages and loyal about hours. She learned that Sam had opinions about grain storage that were on examination entirely correct, and she began adapting her systems accordingly. She learned the ranch from the inside, the way you learn a language, by living in it, not through instruction, but through practice, through the accumulated weight of days that taught you how things worked and why. May Cooper continued her education in medicine. By February, Nora could treat minor wounds, recognize the signs of infection, manage a fever with reasonable competence, and splint a simple fracture. She was not a doctor, but in this country, she was considerably more than nothing. This proved itself in March. Young Danny slipped on ice behind the barn and came up with his arm at a wrong angle, white-faced and silent in the way people are silent when pain is too large for sound. Nora was there in 6 minutes, and by the time Eli arrived, she had assessed the fracture, splinted the arm with 2 lengths of straight wood from the wood pile, and sent Pete for the laudanum she kept in the kitchen cabinet. Sam, who had been watching, said afterward, "I've seen men ride 60 miles in worse shape than he'd have been without you, ma'am." She accepted the compliment without deflection, which was also something she was learning. There were letters from Clara arriving irregularly but with a warmth that grew with each one. Nora read them at the kitchen table in the evenings, and they were a kind of company, a thread running back to a woman who was figuring out her own life in her own way. Clara had gone to Richmond as planned to their uncle's house and had quickly discovered that a beautiful, well-connected young woman with modest means was a sought-after commodity in that particular social marketplace. She did not seem distressed by this. She seemed, for the first time in the letters Nora had known her, to write genuinely curious about what she wanted. "She sounds different," Eli observed one evening looking up from his own work as Nora folded a letter. "She sounds like herself," Nora said. "I don't think I'd heard that before." "What do you mean?" "Back home, she was always performing. Beautiful Clara, accomplished Clara, the daughter who would save the family. She'd been playing that role so long, I don't think even she knew the difference between the character and the person." She folded the letter carefully. "Now there's no one to save. The estate is gone. Father is—" She stopped, then continued evenly. "Father is failing, according to Clara's last letter. He moved to their uncle's as well. He's not well." Eli set down his pen. "How are you with that?" She thought about it honestly. "I don't know yet," she said. "He was not a good father to me for most of my life. He was afraid and selfish, and he used his daughters as currency, and when I chose my own currency instead, he called it betrayal." A pause. "But he was also the man who taught me to manage accounts, who spent 3 years after my mother died not managing well, which meant I had to learn to manage instead. And that turned out to be one of the most useful things that ever happened to me." She looked at the fire. "I think I'm grieving him already a little. Not who he was, who he could have been." Eli said nothing. He came and sat beside her on the settee, which was something he had begun doing in the evenings. Not always, not with ceremony, just sometimes. And she had begun to lean against him slightly when he did, which was something she had not expected to find natural and had found completely natural. "My father taught me to read a landscape," he said. "Not much else. He died when I was 22, before I'd built anything worth showing him." A pause. "I used to think I was building the ranch partly for him, to prove something to a man who couldn't receive the proof." "Did you ever stop?" "Eventually." He looked at the fire. "I started building it for me. That was better." She thought about this for a while. Outside, the wind was doing what it did in Montana in February, which was everything. Howling, sighing, pressing against the windows, with the insistence of something that knew it would win in the end if it was patient enough. "I'm building this for me," she said quietly. "This life, this work." She looked around the room at the curtains she had sewn, the books on the shelves, the mended shirt folded on the chair, the accounts ledger on the table that she now kept with the same careful precision she had kept her father's, and the result was prosperity instead of disaster. "I've never had that before. Something that was actually mine." Eli turned to look at her. In the firelight, his face was the face she had come to know. The hard angles softened by use, the winter eyes carrying less of their perpetual assessment and more of something else. Something that had been growing quietly over the past months, the way things grow in cold climates, slowly and with great eventual strength. "It is yours," he said, "all of it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she leaned forward and kissed him, not gently, not tentatively, but with the directness she brought to everything that mattered. He kissed her back with the same quality. When they pulled apart, she said, "I think I'm falling in love with you." He was quiet for a moment. "I was wondering when you'd notice." "When I'd—" She stared at him. "You've been waiting." "Since about November." The barest hint of amusement in his expression. "You were very focused on the accounts." She laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, and he smiled, and the smile transformed his face, the way weather transforms a landscape suddenly and completely. "I love you," he said more plainly, the smile settling into something quieter. "Not because you manage the ranch well, or because you're capable in a crisis, or because you make the hands treat each other with more decency than they managed before you arrived. Though all of those things are true, I love you because you're honest when honesty is difficult, and you're brave without making a production of it, and you look at hard things clearly and choose to face them anyway." A pause. "And I love you because on my first night in your father's house, you sat beside me in the dark on a porch and didn't try to fill the silence. You just let it be what it was." She felt something shift in her chest, the last deepest layer of the defenses she had been building for 22 years. The layer that said nothing good lasts, the layer that said you are not the one who gets chosen for the real reasons, the layer that said wanting things is just another way to lose them. That layer cracked. She put her hand against his jaw. I love you too, she said. I think I have for a while. I've been very focused on the accounts. He laughed. It was the best sound she had heard in a very long time. That night, they were not careful and not courteous and not the studied strangers they had been in the early months. They were two people who had chosen each other with their eyes open and were now choosing each other again with full knowledge of what the choice meant. Afterward, lying in the dark with his arm around her and the wind outside doing its perpetual insistent work, she thought, I am exactly where I am supposed to be. She had never thought that before about any place she had been. One evening in late February, Eli came in from the far pasture with something in his expression she hadn't seen before, a new quality of unsettlement, distinct from the slow-settling grief she had come to know. He sat down at the kitchen table, and she put coffee in front of him and waited. Letter came in town today, he said. He set it on the table. The envelope was expensive. The handwriting was precise and controlled, the handwriting of someone who had once had ambitions about how they presented themselves to the world. She looked at the return address. Her chest tightened. It was not from Clara. It was not from Virginia. It was from a Frank Slade currently residing in the town of Millbrook, Montana Territory, 15 miles north. He knows you're here, Eli said. Nora picked up the letter. She read it without hurrying. In clear business-like language, it informed Eli Holt that certain debts incurred by Harlan Calloway of Virginia before his recent death, which Nora had not yet received word of, which meant this was how she was learning her father was gone, had transferred with the marriage of Harlan's daughter to Eli Holt, and that Frank Slade would be calling to discuss the terms of settlement. She set the letter down. Her father was dead. She received this information the way you receive information about something you had already half prepared yourself for, not without feeling, but without collapse. He's coming here, she said. The letter says he'll be in the area next week. She looked at the envelope, then she looked at Eli. How do you want to handle this? I want to ride to Millbrook and… No. Her voice was quiet but certain. That's what he wants. He wants you to come to him angry. He wants the confrontation to be on his terms. She thought about this man who had loved Rose Holt and lost her and had apparently spent years nursing that loss into something with sharper edges. He's not stupid, Eli. He's been patient. He didn't just walk onto your ranch when you weren't expecting him. He sent a letter. He wants you to come to him. So we don't go to him. We wait for him to come here. And when he does, she turned the envelope over in her hands. I have letters from my father's correspondence with Slade. Clara found them after father died and sent them to me months ago. Terms, amounts, dates. If Slade tries to claim we owe him money, he can't document properly. We have documentation of what was actually agreed. She met Eli's eyes. And if he tries to use the money as a pretext for something else, then we deal with what it actually is. Yes. Eli looked at her across the table at this woman who had been his wife for less than 4 months and who was sitting in his kitchen at 10 o'clock at night, calmly analyzing a threat and planning a response and not asking him to handle it for her. Nora, he said. Yes, I'm glad I chose you. She looked at him. Something moved in her chest, something quiet and certain, the particular feeling of hearing the truth said out loud. So am I, she said. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the dark with the sound of the sky saying something that didn't have words yet. Somewhere to the north, Frank Slade was 15 miles away and coming closer. The past was still unfinished. But Nora Holt sat in a warm kitchen with a cup of coffee and her husband across the table. And for the first time in her life, she was facing what was coming, not alone but alongside someone. That made all the difference. Part 3, The Woman Who Remained. Frank Slade arrived on a Tuesday. Nora was in the barn when she heard the horse, a single rider, coming up the main road at a pace that was neither hurried nor casual, the pace of someone who had decided exactly how they wanted to arrive. She looked through the barn doors and saw him dismount at the post-medium height, perhaps 50, with a face that had once been handsome and was now precise. He wore a good coat and carried himself with the careful dignity of a man who had suffered defeats and was determined never to look like he had. He looked toward the house. He did not look toward the barn. She set down what she was doing, wiped her hands on her work apron, and walked toward him. Mr. Slade, he turned, whatever he had expected. A kitchen door opening, Eli Holt emerging with something between his eyes. He had not expected the woman from the barn. His expression recalibrated quickly, but not quickly enough. Mrs. Holt. He touched his hat. His voice was controlled and pleasant. I was hoping to speak with your husband. He's in the north pasture until evening. She stopped a few feet from him and looked at him with the same direct assessment she had given every piece of information that came to this ranch. You could wait, or you could speak with me now. I'm aware of the situation. A pause. He studied her. She let him. The situation that he said finally involves a debt incurred by your father that by the terms of the original agreement transfers to his estate and by extension to me as the inheriting party, since my father left nothing to inherit except what he owed. She kept her voice even. I'm aware of the terms, Mr. Slade. I have the original correspondence. Something shifted in his expression. He had been expecting a negotiation about what she knew. She had just removed that variable. Then you know what I'm owed, he said. I know what my father agreed to, and I know that the agreement had specific conditions that were not fully met on either side. She met his eyes steadily. I also know that you've been in Montana territory for at least a year, that you knew where the Holt Ranch was, that you waited until my father died before making contact. He said nothing. That's patient, she said. Patience is a quality I respect, but I'd prefer we not pretend this is only about a debt. He looked at her for a long moment. This was a man accustomed to managing the terms of conversations she understood, accustomed to setting them up so the other person spent all their effort responding rather than asking. She had declined to play that particular game, which had caught him without a ready adjustment. Your husband killed my wife, he said finally. Not loudly, just placed there like a stone. Your wife chose my husband, Nora said carefully. There's a difference. One of them you had control over. His jaw tightened. There was real pain under the precision. She could see that. That was important to understand. He was not simply an adversary. He was a man who had loved someone and lost her, and had let the loss become something that justified worse things than grief. Rose was afraid of you in the last weeks of her life, Nora said quietly. I think you know that. The precision in his face wavered. I didn't mean I never meant for... He stopped. Something was happening in his expression, something she had not expected, not calculation, but the particular disorientation of someone confronting what they have done without the buffer of the story they have built around it. It was only supposed to scare her. I wanted her to understand what she had given up. I wanted her to be afraid so she would come back. He looked at his hands. I didn't know she'd fall. The silence was very long. Nora stood in the yard of the ranch she had come to know as home and looked at a man who had caused the death of another person through exactly the kind of desperate, small, ruinous act that desperate people perform when they cannot accept what they cannot have. She felt no anger. She felt something more complicated, the particular sadness of seeing very clearly how a human being can destroy themselves and others through an accumulation of choices that all in the moment seem survivable. Does anyone else know? She said. No, he looked up. Just me, and now you. Jed Cooper suspects. He absorbed this. He can't prove it. No, and I don't think he will unless something happens to give him reason. She held Slade's gaze. I'm not going to tell you what to do with what you carry. That's between you and whatever you decide to do with your remaining years. She reached into her apron pocket and removed an envelope. But I am going to settle this clearly. She held out the envelope. He took it. That contains the documentation of what my father owed you, what he paid, and what remains outstanding. It also contains a draft drawn on our account for the remaining amount in full to the penny. She waited while he looked at the contents. When you cash that draft, we're done. The debt is cleared. You have no further claim on this ranch or this family. He looked up from the papers. And if I don't accept, he said, then we go to court. I have the documentation. You have a personal grievance that you've been managing into something it was never going to be. She kept her voice level, not threatening, just clear. I'm not asking you to forget Rose. I'm asking you to stop letting her death be the thing that defines whatever time you have left. A pause. She was a person, not a wound. Something cracked in his expression, just slightly. The precision fragmented at one edge, and she could see behind it the man he might have been if different decisions had led to a different place. He looked at the papers in his hands. He looked at her. You're not what I expected, he said. I've been told that before. He was quiet for a long moment. The horses moved in the pasture behind the fence. Somewhere in the north field, Eli was working without knowing this conversation was happening. The full amount is in the draft, Slade said finally. Not a question. Every penny. He folded the envelope and put it in his breast pocket. He looked at her once more, not with the calculation of before, but with something else, something that might have been a kind of recognition. She would have liked you, he said. Rose. She valued people who didn't pretend. He touched his hat again. Mrs. Holt. He mounted his horse and rode back down the road. She stood in the yard for a while after the sound of hooves faded her hands, still at her sides, breathing the cold March air. Above her, the sky was enormous and pale and indifferent, in the way the Montana sky was always indifferent, and somewhere a hawk was riding the updraft over the ridge in slow, patient circles. She went inside and started lunch. She told Eli that evening. She told him all of it, the conversation, what Slade had said about the saddle strap, the draft she had drawn, the terms of the settlement. She told him calmly and completely, sitting across the kitchen table from him, with her hands folded, and she watched him receive it. He was quiet for a long time after she finished. You handled it alone, he said finally. Not with accusation, with something more careful. You weren't here, and I didn't want you to be for that particular conversation. She met his eyes. I needed to be the one who faced him. Not because I don't trust you, and not because I wanted to protect you from it, but because she searched for the right words. Because it was mine to face. The debt was my father's. The fear was partly mine. I needed to be the one who stood there and decided what we did about it. He looked at her. I would have gone with you, he said. I know, and I may have been wrong not to ask. She paused. Was it wrong? He thought about it honestly. No, he said. I think you were right about what the conversation needed to be. He'd have been different with me there. More defensive, less likely to say what he said. A pause. About Rose. He didn't mean for her to dumber, Nora said quietly. I believe that. It doesn't make it less of what it is, but I believe it. Eli stood and walked to the window, and she let him. She had learned to let him have his silences, the ones that were not withdrawal, but thinking, not absence, but process. He stood there for several minutes looking at the dark yard, and she waited. Then he came back to the table. He sat down. He looked at her with those winter sky eyes that had stopped being cold months ago, that had become something else. Something that still saw everything, but now saw it with warmth. I've been carrying the guilt of Rose's death for 3 years, he said. Not just the grief which I'd have carried regardless, but the specific weight of believing I had failed to keep her safe, that my carelessness had cost her life. He turned his hands over on the table, looking at them. That weight was I built around it. I built the ranch around it. I worked harder because I thought I owed something. I stayed away from people because I didn't trust myself to protect them. She said nothing. Let him say what needed saying. Knowing it wasn't what I thought, it doesn't undo 3 years. It doesn't bring her back. And I still grieve her, Nora. I need you to understand that. She was real to me, and I loved her in the way you love things when you're young and certain before life teaches you what love actually requires. He paused. But the guilt, I've been allowed to set it down now, and I don't know what to do with my hands without it. Nora reached across the table and put her hands over his. Fill them with something else, she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression broke open, not in the way that breaking is damage, but in the way that sometimes things have to open before they can be filled. He raised one of her hands to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles. A gesture not of romance, but of genuine thankfulness, the kind that has nowhere else to go. I love you, he said. I know, she said. I love you too. They stayed like that for a while, 2 people at a kitchen table in Montana, the fire low. The wind outside, the enormous sky pressing down on everything with its perpetual indifferent beauty. Not dramatic, not picturesque, just true. Spring came the way Montana spring always comes, suddenly and then relentlessly. The snow began to go in March, not all at once, but in patches, retreating to the shadows in the north-facing slopes, while the south-facing ground darkened and softened and began to smell of the earth underneath. The cattle grew restless in their winter pastures. The horses were faster in the mornings. And in the 3rd week of March, the first calf was born, and the season was upon them. Nora had helped at calving before. She had not done it at this scale with this many animals and weather that could turn on you between 1 hour and the next. For 3 weeks, the ranch operated on abbreviated sleep and maximum attention. Everyone on rotating shifts covering the pastures, watching for the signs that told you a cow needed help before she was past helping. She learned new things every day. She pulled calves beside the hands who had been doing it for years and who by the third week had stopped treating her like someone to be supervised and started treating her like someone to consult. When Sam's instinct and her instinct disagreed about an animal, they worked it out between them without either of them deferring simply out of custom. She saved a calf at 2 in the morning on a night when the temperature dropped back to something that belonged to February, her hands deep in the work and her knees in cold mud, and the mother's labored breathing the only sound in the dark barn. The calf came out alive. She sat back on her heels and looked at the small, damp creature, finding its legs for the first time, and she felt something she didn't have a precise word for. Something that was satisfaction, but also more than that, something that was about the reality of new life and the work required to ensure it and the knowledge that the work had mattered. Eli found her there an hour later, still in the barn, watching the calf nurse. He sat down beside her in the straw and looked at what she was looking at. "You've been here a while," he said. "I didn't want to leave before I knew she was all right." "She's all right. I know, I'm staying anyway." He put his arm around her. She leaned into him. They watched the calf together in the quiet barn, and the night outside was cold and vast, and the sky was full of more stars than you could count, even if you spent a lifetime trying. Before the ranch wives came, there was the matter of Jed. She had been thinking about it since the night Eli came back from the barn with his face changed. She had watched Jed in the weeks since, watched him do his work with the same careful competence, watched him look at Eli with the same complicated steadiness, watched him carry what he carried, the way people carry things that are too heavy to set down, but not heavy enough to require visible effort. She found him one morning in early April repairing the hinge on the far barn door. He heard her boots and turned without surprise. "Mrs. Holt?" "Nora," she said. She had been asking the hands to call her that for months. Most of them had managed it. Jed still mostly couldn't. "Ma'am." She leaned against the barn wall and looked at the hinge he was working on. "You've been quiet since Eli spoke to you." "I'm generally quiet." "Differently quiet." He set down his tools and turned to face her properly. He had the face of a man who had learned honesty the hard way through the cost of not being honest at the right time, and who was still working out where the line was between protection and harm. "I did what I thought was right," he said, protecting him. "I know. I don't know if it was right." "It wasn't," she said without cruelty, "but it was understandable, and it came from the right place." She looked at him directly. "He knows that. He's not going to tell you he's forgiven you because that's not how he handles things. But he asked you to come to breakfast this morning the same as always. That's his version of it." Something shifted in Jed's expression, the particular easing of someone who has been waiting for a verdict and finally received it. "He talked to you about it," he said. "He talks to me about most things now." Jed looked at her for a moment. "You're good for him," he said. "Not gallantly, as a fact." "I know." She pushed off the wall. "And he's good for me, which is how it's supposed to work." She left him to the hinge. That evening at the supper table, she watched Jed and Eli exchange the easy, practical shorthand of men who have worked alongside each other for years. Not warm, they were not warm men, either of them, but settled. The particular comfort of people who have decided to continue. She filed this in the ledger of things that were going right. In April, the ranch wives came. May Cooper organized it. She had been organizing it apparently since Nora's arrival, waiting for the right moment and the right weather and the right sense that Nora was ready to be welcomed into the community of women who had built their lives in this hard country. 6 of them arrived on a Saturday morning with food and instruments and children who immediately scattered in every direction. The house filled with sound in a way it hadn't since Nora arrived, and she found herself standing in the kitchen doorway, watching it happen and feeling something expand in her chest. These women were nothing like the women she had known in Virginia, not the genteel social performers of her childhood trading, calling cards, and careful opinions. They were direct and practical and funny in the way people are funny when they have learned to laugh at the right things. They talked about land and livestock and husbands and children and the particular experience of loving a country that demanded everything in return for its beauty, and they talked to her as if she were already one of them. "You're settling in," May said, not as a question, as they worked together in the kitchen while music drifted from the main room. "Yes." Nora chopped carrots with steady hands, better than I expected. "You were never going to have trouble settling in." May measured flour with the precision of long practice. "The trouble was going to be whether the place was worth settling into." Nora looked at her sideways. "Some women come out here and they find the country is too much, too big, too cold, too relentless. And some women find that the size of it is exactly what they needed. May's expression was matter of fact. You needed space, room to be as large as you actually are without worrying about whether it was too much. Nora thought about Clara's voice in the dark of the old house. Be as large as you actually are. My sister said something like that, she said. Smart woman. She is. Nora was quiet for a moment. She's getting married to a man who from her letter seems to value exactly who she is. A pause. I'm glad for her. We had to go in completely different directions to find the same thing. What thing? Someone who sees us. She thought about Eli, about the bruise on her jaw in her father's house, and the way he had looked at her and filed it and acted on it without performance. About sitting on the porch in the rain and the silence being what it was. About a kitchen table at midnight and two people planning together. About a moment in a barn at 2 in the morning watching a new life find its feet. Someone who looks at you and sees the actual person, not the function, not the role, the person. May was quiet for a moment, then she said, Jack has been looking at me that way for 20 years. Is it still the same? Better. May's voice was simple. Everything that's worth anything gets better. Oh, yeah. Summer arrived and the ranch moved into its high season, the great rhythmic surge of work that the winter plans had been building toward. Fences repaired and extended. Cattle rotated through pastures on the schedule Nora had helped Eli plan over the winter evenings. The garden behind the house producing abundantly more than she had hoped for from ground she had broken herself from frozen earth in March. She rode Liberty. Eli had given her the horse in June, not with ceremony, not as a gift exactly, but as a statement of fact. A mare with intelligent eyes and a forward-looking quality given the name Nora had chosen, and the freedom to go where she needed to go without asking anyone's permission or availability. She rode to Mays, she rode to town, she rode the perimeter of the ranch in the early mornings when the light was new and the world had not yet decided what the day would be, and she learned the land from horseback, the way Eli knew it intimately, practically as a place with a character and a set of demands and a particular beauty that required your full attention to see properly. One August evening, after the hands had eaten and gone and the dishes were done, Eli spread a map on the kitchen table. Nora stood beside him, and they looked at it together, the 3,000 acres, the pastures marked with the rotation schedule they had developed, the creek that ran year-round, the high ground that he had been thinking about for timber. The Morrison place is selling their north section, he said. Jack told me last week he's scaling back. His eldest son is taking over the core operation, and Jack wants to simplify. She looked at the map. How much? 600 acres. It borders our east fence line. He pointed. Good grazing, one reliable water source. Would take 2 seasons of management before it was fully productive, but it would be worth it. She studied the contours. If we rotate cattle through here during the third quarter, it takes pressure off the south pasture, which has been showing signs of overuse. She traced the line with her finger. And the water source gives us flexibility in dry years. He looked at her sideways. She had been doing this more thinking about the ranch, not just in terms of its current state, but its future shape the way a person thinks about land they intend to still be standing on in 20 years. We need to take a loan, he said. Against what security? Our current holding. We're in a strong position. The bank in Helena has been favorable since we settled the Slade matter. She nodded slowly, working through the numbers in her mind. He waited. This was something he did that she had come to depend on, the way he waited genuinely without filling the silence with his own conclusion while she reached hers. Do it, she said. Buy the land. We can service the loan with the fall drive revenue and have it retired in 3 years. She looked at him. Unless you see something in the numbers I'm not seeing. No, he said. I see the same numbers. A pause. I wanted to know what you thought before I decided. She looked at him, this man who had been building things alone for 20 years and had decided at 42 that building together was worth the adjustment. Then we're agreed, she said. He folded the map. She made coffee. They sat together at the table and talked about the land for another hour, and it was the most ordinary evening imaginable, and it was exactly what she had wanted always and had not known how to name. In July, a letter came from Clara. It was the best letter she had ever received. Clara wrote about her engagement to a man named Robert, a man who she said had looked at her not like a prize or a solution or a beautiful thing to display, but like a person he wanted to talk to and thought about when she wasn't there. He was a lawyer with a quiet manner and a dry wit, and apparently an inexhaustible supply of patience for Clara's opinions, which were, she admitted, extensive. They were planning a small wedding. She was not nervous in the way she had been nervous about the arrangement in Virginia. She was nervous in a completely different way, the way you are nervous about things that matter. She enclosed a single pressed violet from the Richmond garden where Robert had proposed. "She's going to be happy," Nora said, and she meant it completely. Eli looked up from his work. "You sound sure." "I am. She found someone who sees her." She held the dried violet carefully. "The rest will follow from that." Yay. The anniversary of her arrival came in November, quiet as the first snowfall. Eli presented her with a new bridle for Liberty, hand-tooled by a craftsman in Helena, with her name worked into the leather in a way that was both practical and, in its quiet way, beautiful. She ran her thumb over the letters and felt the good weight of a thing made to last. That evening, the hands joined them for supper, and Sam brought his fiddle, and after the meal there was music and the kind of company that comes from people who have worked alongside each other through difficulty and come out the other side with something that is not exactly friendship, but is more solid than mere familiarity. Young Danny called for a speech. The others echoed him with the comfortable ease of people who have decided they are allowed to ask for things. Nora stood. She had not been afraid of being looked at for some time now. It had left her gradually the way fears leave you when you're too busy to maintain them. "A year ago," she said, "I came here not knowing what I was walking into. I'd spent my whole life being told I was ordinary, useful, good enough for the necessary work, but not the kind of woman anyone chose first." She looked around the table at these faces that had become familiar, at Jed's careful eyes, at Danny's open expression, at Sam's weathered stillness, at all of them. "I believe that. When you hear something often enough and from enough people, you start to accept it as fact." She paused. "This place taught me something different. It taught me that what you can do matters more than how you look doing it. That partnership is built from honest work and honest words, so as not from performances and pretty arrangements. That the life worth having is the one you choose with clear eyes, even when, especially when it's the harder choice." She looked at Eli. "I'm grateful to every person in this room, for your patience while I learned, for your respect once I proved myself, for making this place a home." She raised her cup. "To the work," she said, "and the people worth doing it with." "To Mrs. Holt," Jed said, and raised his cup, and the others echoed it, and Nora felt something in her chest that was too large and too complete for a name, but which she recognized after a moment as simple happiness. Later, when the hands had gone and the dishes were done and the house had settled into its nighttime quiet, she and Eli stood at the window and looked out at the land in the moonlight, the grasslands silver and vast, the mountains dark against a sky that held more stars than you could count. "Do you ever regret it?" he said. Not the way people ask things they already know the answer to. He asked it the way he asked everything straight, wanting the truth. She thought about it. She thought about her father gone, now gone, before she could tell him the things she had spent a year figuring out she needed to say, which was a grief she was still making her peace with. She thought about Clara finding her way. She thought about Virginia and the house that was rotting, and the slow suffocation of usefulnesses without value labor, without acknowledgement. Days that accumulated into nothing but more days. She thought about 2 in the morning in a cold barn with a new calf finding its feet. She thought about a kitchen table and a man across from her who treated her plans as part of the planning and her mind as part of the thinking. She thought about Frank Slade riding away down the road carrying what he carried, and the particular feeling of having faced something and not been broken by it. "No," she said, "not for a moment." He put his arm around her. She leaned against him. "What was the hardest thing that he asked?" She thought about this. "Believing I deserved it," she said finally. "The good parts. It took a long time to believe I was allowed to have a life that was actually good, that it wasn't being selfish or reckless or wrong somehow." She paused. "I'd spent so many years accepting less than I needed, that needing was something I'd learned to be ashamed of. And now I need things freely and without apology." She looked up at him. "And I ask for them, which still takes effort sometimes." He kissed her forehead. "You're allowed to need things, Nora." "I know," she said. "I finally know." Macon. There were nights she thought about Rose Holt. Not often and not with jealousy. That particular emotion had never made sense to her, had always seemed like trying to compete with a ghost over ground you already occupied. She thought about her with something more like kinship, a woman who had been real and specific, who had loved storms because they said honest things, who had been afraid in her last weeks and had not said why, who had been taken from the world by an act of desperation from someone who could not bear losing. She had asked Eli once directly what Rose had been like. He had thought about it carefully, the way he thought about everything, and said, "She was funny in a way I didn't expect. She made observations about things that you wouldn't think to observe, and then you couldn't stop seeing them." A pause. She deserved better than she got. From the beginning, from Slade, from me in some ways. She deserved better, and she didn't get enough years to find it. Nora had said, "I think she'd have liked Montana if she'd let it become what it actually was, rather than what she feared it would be." He had looked at her then with an expression she didn't have a word for. "Yes," he said, "I think so too." There was one night a night in September when the last of the summer's warmth was still in the ground, but the darkness had begun to come early when she sat alone in the kitchen after Eli had gone to bed early with a headache, and she thought about all of it. Not in a melancholy way, in the way you think about things when you have enough distance from them that you can see their shape. She thought about the girl she had been in Virginia in brown, always in brown, standing in doorways between one room and another, neither in nor out, useful in the margins. She thought about the morning she had risen before dawn in the parlor and watched the lamplight in the barn and felt something dangerous stir the first small movement of hope in a place where hope had been rationed for years. She thought about a man on a porch in the rain saying the storm was the sky crying out the things it couldn't say in daylight. She thought about her own storms, the ones she had managed quietly without complaint because complaint had never been available to her, the anger she had swallowed, the grief she had not been allowed, the long years of work that built nothing because it was always the work of prevention, preventing collapse, preventing disaster, preventing the visible evidence of a failure that was never hers but which she bore. She thought about the morning she had said yes, and the morning after that, compounding into a year of mornings that were genuinely hers. She took out the small piece of paper from the back of the account ledger. In her careful hand, the sentence she had written on Liberty's Ridge. "I came here as a transaction. I stayed as a woman who could not be bought, traded, or forgotten." She read it once. Then she added below it in smaller letters, "The secret is not that someone chose me. The secret is that I chose myself first, and then I was choosable." She put the paper away. She went upstairs and slid into bed beside her sleeping husband and lay in the dark listening to the particular sound the Montana night made wind and the occasional distant complaint of cattle and the house settling around them. And she thought, "This is mine, all of it. This difficulty and this beauty and this man and this land and this life that I built from a choice I made with clear eyes and trembling hands. Mine." She slept well. She thought about Rose Holt. She kept a small piece of paper in the back of her account ledger where she wrote down things she wanted to remember. Not debts or figures. Things people said. Things she saw. Once in a while, once she had decided the thought was earned a thing she understood about herself. One October morning, riding Liberty up to the high pasture where the grass was golden and the mountains were something out of the oldest part of human memory, she stopped the horse and looked out at everything. 3,000 acres below her running to the horizon. The Holt Ranch, their ranch organized and working and real. The house with smoke rising from its chimney. The fences running in neat lines across the land that had been wild when Eli broke it and was now 30 years of work later home. She had come here as a transaction, a solution to a problem. A woman with calloused hands and no illusions about what was being offered and what was being asked. She had stayed as herself, not as a wife in the way her father had meant the word, not a decoration, not a function, not a thing to smooth the surface of a man's ambitions. As a partner, as a person with her own mind and her own share of what they built and her own name in the leather of her horse's bridle. She had been told once with great authority that she was second best. The consolation prize. The one men settled for when they couldn't have better. She had spent 22 years halfway believing it. She did not believe it now. She reached into the saddlebag and took out the small piece of paper. She wrote in the careful hand she had learned keeping her father's failing books, the sentence she had been building toward for a year. "I came here as a transaction. I stayed as a woman who could not be bought, traded, or forgotten." She looked at it for a moment. Then she put it away, touched her heels to Liberty's flanks, and rode down the hill toward home, toward the smoke and the fences and the work that built something, and the man who had looked at her across a rain-dark parlor and chosen not the performance, not the expectation, not the appointed and appropriate and safe choice, but the truth. She had been the wrong daughter by every measure her father had ever used to measure. She was exactly the right woman. And standing on the ridge of a life she had chosen with her eyes open, watching 3,000 acres of Montana spread out before her like a promise she had earned the right to claim, Nora Holt knew with the bone-deep certainty of someone who has finally arrived at the place they were always meant to be, that the most important thing she had ever done was refuse to stay invisible. She had been overlooked for 22 years. She would not be overlooked again. And somewhere below her, in a house that had become a home, Eli Holt looked up from the accounts he was going over and listened to the sound of his wife's horse coming down the ridge, and something in his chest settled into its proper shape. Isham. There was one more thing that happened that fall. She thought about it often afterward, not as a dramatic moment, not as a turning point, but as a completion. The last piece of something finding its place. It was a Wednesday evening in October, 3 days after the anniversary supper. The hands had gone, the fire was low, and Eli came downstairs from the study where he had been going through some old correspondence. He set something on the kitchen table. It was small, a gold band plain worn with long use, different from the one on her finger. She looked at it, then at him. "Roses," he said. She waited. "I've been keeping it in a box in the desk for 3 years. I didn't know what to do with it. Couldn't wear it. I'm not that kind of man. Couldn't throw it away. So I kept it, and I didn't look at it, which is a way of carrying something without admitting you're carrying it." He stood across the table from her. "I took it out tonight, and I held it for a while. And I thought she would have liked you." A pause. "Not because you're similar, you're not, but because you see clearly and you say what you see and you don't perform anything." She valued that. She wasn't always able to do it herself, but she valued it in other people. Nora looked at the ring on the table. "She was real," she said. "She mattered, and I've never wanted you to pretend otherwise." "I know." He picked up the ring. He turned it over in his fingers once. Then he set it down again gently with the deliberateness of a decision being made. "I'm going to have it melted down and made into something else. I haven't decided what. Something for the ranch. Something that lasts." He looked at her. "Is that all right?" She understood what he was asking. He was not asking permission. He was asking if she understood what it meant, that this was not forgetting, not replacing, not pretending the past had been different. It was integration. It was a man who had loved someone and lost her and had now built a life that was different and real and worth the building, and who was choosing to carry the past in a new shape rather than in the original wound. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." He crossed to her side of the table and stood beside her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment, just the particular comfort of standing close to someone who has earned the closeness. Then she put the kettle on. They had accounts to finish. The ranch was the ranch, and tomorrow would come early, and the work was always the work. She had never loved anything more. And somewhere below her, in a house that had become a home, Eli Holt looked up from the accounts he was going over and listened to the sound of his wife's horse coming down the ridge, and something in his chest settled into its proper shape. The ranch was 3,000 acres. It was also finally 2 people. That was the larger thing. If this story of choosing yourself moved, you hit the like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far Nora's journey travels. Subscribe to follow what comes next. The best stories are always the ones about the woman nobody saw coming.